If everyone could please take a seat, we're about ready to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Adrienne Beggs, and I'm a junior. I'm a junior physics major and math minor, and I would like to welcome Dr. Hansen today. We're really pleased to have him here. Out of respect, we kindly ask that you turn off all electronic devices, such as cell phones, laptops, and tablets. Also, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, please keep your masks on while indoors. So now I'm just going to say a little bit more about Dr. Hansen's work. He is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Earth Institute and the director of the Climate Science Program. Dr. Hansen was the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He was trained in physics and astronomy, and since the late 1970s, he has focused on researching anthropogenic climate change. Dr. Hansen is best known for his testimony on climate change to congressional committees in the 1980s that helped raise broad awareness of the global warming issue. Additionally, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1995, and he was designated by Time magazine in 2006 as one of the 100 most influential people on Earth. He has received numerous awards, including the Carl Gustav Rosby and Roger Revelle Research Medals, the Sophie Prize, and the Blue Planet Prize. Throughout his lifetime, he has been committed to educating on the risks that climate change poses for society, especially on younger generations such as us. Dr. Hansen is famous for his pursuit of the truth, such as identifying ineffectual policies as greenwash. He is active in seeking solutions to climate change and outlining actions that the public must take in securing a safe and better future. Please give a warm welcome and a round of applause to Dr. Hansen.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. Must be tempting to be outdoors. So, shape your future. Energy, climate change, and human rights. It's possible, and it's not as hard as you may think. If you understand the single basic underlying problem. If you address that problem successfully, everything else becomes pretty straightforward, including climate change. That's a big claim. But first, let me mention our friends in Ukraine who are inspiring us all. You know, they remind us of the time our founders, including some of the wealthiest people in the land, had the courage to risk it all, to pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. And of course, that's from the last sentence of the Declaration of Independence. And that was about, as they were about to take on the military force that was far superior of the British Empire, the force of the British Empire. And they did that to fight for unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, that's the first line of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Now, let me start by saying that I'm a political independent. I'm unsatisfied with both of our political parties. I grew up in western Iowa, the fifth of 7 children of an itinerant landless farmer. And by the way, this photo is not a case of cruelty to animals. These skinny girls are not bothering the cow. They were born during the Depression. I was born before the United States entered World War II. The thing I wanted to mention about my 4 older sisters is they're an example that shows to me the value of pre-K education. My mother would, she had homework and garden work and farm work she had to do, would tell them to go play school. And my oldest sister was an avid reader who got books from her great aunt and from her school teacher. And as a result, all 4 of them became very good readers before they were in kindergarten. And I think that one of the things that all of our parties should support is universal pre-K education, because it's such an important thing in order that all people have equal opportunity. Now, the first president that I remember when I was a boy was give 'em hell Harry Truman. He was an exceptional president, in my opinion. He was the force behind the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and the U.S. provided global leadership in the formation of organizations such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations itself, and he spurred a global economic cooperation. It was not a case of zero-sum game. The United States then was the shining city on a hill, which provided an example of force for world progress. And I think it's useful also to place the American democracy in a broader context. The age of science and reason began with Galileo's telescope, which proved that Copernicus was right. The Earth is not the center of the universe, not even the center of the solar system. But the principal political product of the Enlightenment was the American Revolution and the Constitution, which established a democratic, republican form of government with a division of power among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And this government of the people, by the people, and for the people was threatened by the domestic polarization over slavery, which was resolved by the Civil War, and then threatened by the populist movements of Nazism and fascism settled by World War II. And the U.S., I think, and world democracy reached a pinnacle of success when we landed a man on the moon and when the Berlin Wall fell. But we let a problem grow, a fundamental underlying problem that neither political party is willing to address. It's a problem that is not that hard to solve once you understand it. So let's talk about that. But first, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, I was in high school. At that time, life was less stressful for young people in the 1950s, and the federal government made college affordable. A student could work their way through college and graduate without any debt. Today, our government sides with the big banks. You know, I was especially lucky to find my way to the physics and astronomy department of James Van Allen. And I did not have to pay 1 cent for graduate school because the federal government provided the university 30 graduate traineeships in space science. The objective was to beat the Soviets in space science. Now, Professor Van Allen instilled the scientific method in different ways, but one way was requiring each student to make, if they wanted to go to graduate school, to a PhD program, we had to make a original proposition and defend that before a committee of professors. And to be successful in science, you have to be very skeptical of your own interpretation, and you have to honestly reassess from scratch when new data become available. Your preference, your ideology must not affect your assessment. And that's one reason I like to be a political independent. And this point is difficult for many people, even for many scientists. But my graduate school research was on Venus, and because it is closer to the sun, Venus experienced a runaway greenhouse effect. And we have a nice comparison among the 3 inner planets in how warm they are and in how strong the gases which act like a blanket in the atmosphere and tend to keep the heat at the surface. We see how the greenhouse effect works of these gases that absorb infrared heat radiation. One of the interesting issues when I was a student was, what are these clouds that completely cover the planet Venus? So I was fortunate to get a scholarship postdoctoral scholarship to study under Hank van de Hulst in the Netherlands. He was the world's leading expert in light scattering. And then I joined NASA and proposed an experiment to go to Venus on the Pioneer Venus mission and measure the polarization of the sunlight reflected by the planet. And we're able to show that these clouds are sulfuric acid. It's not a very romantic planet. It's very hot, and you could not live there for a matter of minutes. But meanwhile, on the Earth, I began to work on calculations for the greenhouse effect on the Earth, because we realized that our atmosphere was changing. Methane and nitrous oxide and CO2 were all increasing. And I actually resigned as the principal investigator on the Venus experiment before it got to the planet, and my friend became the PI. Because it was more important, it seemed to me, to understand our own atmosphere and what the effect of these increasing gases would be. So I used observations of weather stations to develop a history of the Earth's temperature for the last century and a half. And I worked with a team of colleagues to develop a mathematical model of Earth's climate. And the physics is simple. Normally, the Earth sends back to space the same amount of energy that it receives from the sun, and the global temperature is stable. However, added CO2 blocks heat radiation from the Earth, with more energy then coming in than going out. Earth is going to get warmer. However, it takes centuries for the ocean to fully warm up and restore energy balance. And that delay is both bad and good. It's bad because it means that people don't notice that much climate change is happening until a lot more is in the pipeline. But the delay is good because it gives us time to fix the problem if we have our wits about us. You know, we can now measure Earth's energy balance imbalance by measuring the rate at which the heat content is changing in Earth's heat reservoirs. And the biggest reservoir by far is the ocean. And we now sample that with several thousand Argo floats, which dive to a depth of a couple of kilometers and make measurements, come up and radio the information to a satellite. And what we find is that the ocean is gaining heat at a rate of about almost 1 watt per square meter. Now 1 watt is pretty small. You probably know what a 100-watt light bulb is, right? A tiny Christmas tree bulb is about 1 watt. So that doesn't sound like a lot of energy, but it's 20 times greater than the rate of energy use by all of humanity, because the Earth is a big planet. And it's equivalent to exploding about 600,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, every day. That much energy is going into the ocean and warming the ocean. On the other hand, 1 watt is not all that big. If you held up 1 square meter directly to sunlight, that's about 1,000 watts going through that square meter. The amount absorbed by the Earth, because averaging over day and night, and excluding the sunlight that's just reflected by the planet, is about 240 watts per square meter. So we're increasing that by less than 1%, but it's a solvable problem. We don't want people, especially young people, should not be worried about global warming. They should be concerned about it, but we can deal with it if we know what we're doing. But Earth is getting warmer. The ocean is getting warmer. Sea surface temperature is increasing, and the land surface temperature is increasing even faster. That's about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit per decade. And it's beginning to have effects. For example, the ice sheets are beginning to melt more. This is Mulin, vertical shaft on the Greenland ice sheet, where the summer melt goes down to the base of the ice sheet, and it speeds up the discharge of giant icebergs to the ocean. So Greenland and Antarctica are beginning to lose mass, and sea level is beginning to rise. It's now 3.5 millimeters a year. So over the last century, 120 years, sea level has gone up 20 centimeters, which is, 8 inches. It's noticeable, but it's not disastrous. The problem is we could make the West Antarctic ice sheet unstable and lose most of that rapidly on a time scale of decades, with sea level rise of several meters. So we don't want that to happen. More than half of the world's largest cities are on coastlines, and they contain a lot of our history. We can't afford to have the West Antarctic ice sheet go unstable and lose most of the coastal cities. The other thing that is irreversible on any time scale that we would care about is the extermination of species. And we're putting stresses on many species in different ways. And in combination with rapidly changing climate, we could commit a large fraction of the species on the planet to extinction. And again, that's obviously something we don't want to do, and we have to avoid that. An example is coral reefs. We're losing more than 1% of them per year, partly because of the warming ocean and partly because of the ocean is becoming more acid. As it takes up CO2 from the atmosphere, it becomes more acidic, and that dissolves those species that have carbonate skeletons. But when you hear about the existential threat of climate change, that's really the combination of the potential sea level rise and the fact that low latitudes are becoming uncomfortable. The tropics and the subtropics in the summer are becoming so hot that you can't work outdoors for any length of time or have recreational activities. So that's putting a immigration pressure from low latitudes to high latitudes. And if you add to that immigration pressure from coastal cities, if sea level starts to rise significantly, you could have a situation where the planet becomes ungovernable. So we have to avoid that. On the other hand, the thing causing the problem, fossil fuels, is actually very valuable. The Industrial Revolution was energized by fossil fuels, which raised the living standards in Western civilization, beginning with coal and then moving to oil and gas. 1 gallon of gasoline contains the energy equivalent of 400 hours of work by a healthy adult. So it is tremendously useful for raising living standards, and half of the world has raised the standards a lot, and the other half wants to follow that path. And they have the right to raise their living standard, and they will attempt to do that. So, as a result, global energy consumption has increased by a factor of 3 just since 1965. And we hear a lot about renewables now. We're trying to move to energy sources that don't produce CO2. But you can see the green area of renewables is still a small fraction of our total energy use. And so our emissions keep going up, although we now realize that they had better go down close to zero by sometime mid-century, or else we're going to have, we're likely to have unacceptable consequences. And most of that growth is occurring now in places like China and India, which get almost all of their energy from fossil fuels. And it's not so easy to change this. You can't change the basic energy sources quickly, because there's what we call realpolitik, which are the practical matters that governments are not going to let the lights go off, and those governments that are still trying to raise the living standards are going to do that. And then in addition to that, we're just making some bad choices, bad real politics going on, which makes it harder to move to clean energies. So, you know, I worked on the physical sciences part of the problem for most of my career, but by the beginning of this century, I was concerned that we're actually not doing anything. You know, the emissions just kept going up, and even after the Kyoto Protocol, they actually went up faster than they did before that. And all of the scenarios that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all of their scenarios had warming of a few degrees this century, which would mean that you would lose the West Antarctic ice sheet. You can argue about how long it would take. According to our research, it would be by the end of this century, which means that children being born today would be alive, most of them, at the time sea level has gone up several meters. Oh, we can't let that happen. Anyway, so I proposed an alternative scenario with smaller emissions, and I was able to get support from a generous philanthropist, Jerry Lenfest, to pay for workshops at the East-West Center in Hawaii, in which we invited scientists and some businessmen and politically oriented people from China and India, because that's where the emissions are going to be the largest. They already are the largest now in China, more than double the United States. But the government didn't like what I was saying publicly, and there was a call from the White House to NASA headquarters telling NASA to stop me from speaking out, and they did attempt to do that. They insisted that I inform headquarters about any talk I was giving, or if I got a request from the media, before I gave an interview, I had to tell headquarters, and they could substitute somebody else for me. So I let them do that for several weeks to collect the evidence, because that's against our Constitution. There's something called free speech, and that's what they were doing is called prior restraint, and it's not allowed by our Constitution. So when I told the New York Times about it, it hit the front pages of the Times, and then so then I had all these opportunities to speak to environmental groups and others, and so I got involved in the other aspects of this problem, trying to understand the energy picture and the economics, because we need the energy. Fossil fuels are not evil, they're providing what we need, but we can't let them destroy the future for our children and grandchildren. So we have to understand this. You know, I was invited to speak to people like Jim Rogers of Duke Energy and Ralph Izzo of PSE&G. These are the biggest utilities in the eastern United States, and Florida Light and Power. And we agreed to have a workshop to try to, because these people, you know, they're trying to make money for their organizations, but they also have children and grandchildren. They would like to solve the problem, so they're not evil people. So I think we began to understand what was needed, let me to explain this. Amory Lovins is a leading thinker on energy, and he advises governments all around the world. He has received every prize And he continued as energy guru to President Clinton and Al Gore. He visited our institute in the late 1970s when I was doing planetary research and just beginning to think about climate modeling. And he had a deep knowledge of energy efficiency, of the potential to reduce energy demands if we remove the barriers to efficiency. But incredibly, Amory concludes that there is so much potential in energy efficiency that we can get all of our energy from soft renewables. He says that we don't need any fossil fuel, we don't need large hydro, and we don't need nuclear power or a carbon tax. So it's no wonder that that's not what I wanted to do. What I'm trying to do is move my cursor. So it's no wonder that he's gets support from all liberals and from the fossil fuel industry. But by the way, these awards, one of the 100 most influential people, well, I got that award too, and he's also one of the 100 top global thinkers. Well, I got that award too, and our opinions are opposite. So you got to take those awards with a grain of salt. They don't necessarily mean that you've got the right answer. So by that time, I was starting to work with students in a summer program. And so for my research team, I asked them to go back and look at Amory's projections from the 1970s and see how well renewables were growing. They were supposed to grow according to his projections. These soft renewables, this renewables actually includes large hydro, which he says you shouldn't need. But they're supposed to grow according to this line, and then by 2025, all of our energy would be provided by renewables. Well, in reality, it stayed pretty much the same, and I have an update of this chart where it's started to move up a little bit, but it's still only a few percent of our energy. So, and if you look at it globally, solving the United States energy emissions is not going to solve the global problem if China and India are continuing to emit. If you look at the current emissions, this chart on the left, China has now more than doubled the US emissions. But climate change is not caused by today's emissions. It's caused by the cumulative emissions over time. We showed that in a paper in 2007. And the United States is still by far the most responsible for climate change. On a per capita basis, the United States and Canada and Australia are now the highest, but on cumulative emissions, the United States is still, 7 or 8 times more than China and like 20 times more than India. So we can't blame it on them. We really should work together with them to figure out what we're going to do. And it's clear that the essential elements of the solution need to start with, I wrote a letter to President-elect Barack Obama describing the 2 actions that were needed to deal with this. First, we have to make the fossil fuel price include their cost to society. human health cost of air pollution and water pollution and the climate change are not included in the price of fossil fuels. They're allowed to just dump their waste product in the atmosphere, and our young people inherit the consequences. So a rising carbon price is essential if we're going to let the other energy sources compete with fossil fuels. And if we would collect the carbon fee at the sources, the domestic mines and the ports of entry, so it's very easy to collect, it doesn't cost anything, and then distribute the money 100% to the legal residents, an equal amount to all legal residents, then that 70% of the people would come out ahead. The wealthy people would pay more because they have a big carbon footprint, they have big houses, they fly. But this would, if we started out with $10 a ton tax and raised that $10 each year, after 10 years, it would be equivalent to 90 cents a gallon on gasoline, but each person would be getting a couple $1,000s. And in 10 years, that would reduce our emissions 30%. So, and this would stimulate the economy. It actually creates jobs and increases the GNP. And it's the most rapid way to phase down fossil fuel use. And all economists agree with this. It's also the viable international approach, because the countries that have a carbon fee would put a border duty on products from countries that do not have a carbon fee. And that would be a big incentive for the other countries to have their own carbon fee so they can collect the money. But, you know, I started advocating this 15 years ago. When Obama was elected, I wrote this in a letter. My wife and I wrote a letter to Barack and Michelle Obama and told them, this is the most fundamental thing you got to do. And I got to meet with John Kerry, who was in the Senate, shepherding Obama's climate plan. After listening to me for the better part of an hour, he said, that would be best, but I can't get one vote for that. So instead, they tried to pass a Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill with giveaways several thousand pages long, with giveaways to every special interest that could write their paragraph to be included in this bill. And it wouldn't have worked if it had passed. They never got it passed. What would work? Well, here's an important graph. This is the carbon intensity, the amount of carbon per unit energy. We need to get this to go towards zero. What countries did a fairly good job? Sweden and France. Sweden decided, what happened? How did they suddenly go down? They almost solved the problem. If they just electrified their vehicles, they would be near zero. How did they do that? Well, when I was in Sweden, listening to the environmental minister, I asked her, how did you do that? Of course, I knew how she did it, how Sweden did it, but she said, we introduced combined heat and power. That's hogwash. What happened was they built 10 nuclear power plants, and so they had carbon-free electricity. If you have carbon-free electricity, and they also have a lot of hydropower. So between hydropower and nuclear, they had carbon-free electricity. If you have that, you can solve the problem, because you can make liquid fuels from electricity and replace gasoline. But liberals don't want to admit that, so because they don't like nuclear. So the technical tools that we have are energy efficiency, renewable energies, nuclear power. But what happened when President Clinton was elected? That's now 30 years ago. He eliminated, in his first State of the Union message, he said, we're eliminating programs that are no longer needed, such as nuclear power. So we've been subsidizing renewables for 30 years heavily, and they're now providing a few percent of our energy. And I like renewables. Our barn is covered with solar panels. They're part of the solution, but they're not a full solution. There are various, we have the potential with modern nuclear power to have ultra-safe nuclear reactors and provide, if we don't have that, we're going to complement renewables, because renewables are intermittent. They need to be complemented by a 24/7 energy source. And what they're using now is gas. We're moving toward gas. We're using a lot of coal for that, and we're moving toward gas. Unfortunately, gas is almost as bad as coal as far as CO2 is concerned and the greenhouse effect, because methane. I'm going to have to move a little faster, but what happened with nuclear? You know, we've had 100 nuclear power plants in the United States. No one has died because of the nuclear power plants. We had an accident in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island. It released radiation. That radiation didn't kill anybody, but the fear of nuclear power grew and became a political issue. I have a 1 minute. So, if you heard, he said, give me the warm glow of a wood fire. Indoor air pollution kills 3.7 million people per year. Now, it's mostly in China and India, but they're of the order of 50,000 in the United States. More people in one day than have been killed in 50 years of nuclear power. In the case of the worst nuclear accident you can imagine, Fukushima, where you had the meltdown in 3 nuclear power plants, they ordered evacuation of a large part of Japan. That, you know, in the United States, part of the problem is the Democratic Party appoints anti-nuclear people to be on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It sounds insane, but that's the truth. And Harry Reid, senator from Nevada, withheld approval for all of George Bush's appointees until Bush would appoint Harry Reid's assistant to be on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then he twisted the arm of Barack Obama as soon as he was elected to elevate this guy to be the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. When Fukushima went off, this guy went bananas, and he told all Americans to evacuate Japan and pressured the Japanese government to evacuate as much area as possible. More than 1,000 people died from stress and from heartbreak of being forced to leave their homes. And then they realized, then doctors wrote papers later that said nobody except right near the nuclear plant, they should not have evacuated these people. But that's the politics. And you know, the biggest thing that's said about nuclear power is, oh, what about this nuclear waste? The nuclear waste is contained and it's harming nobody. It should be put in a geological storage because it's very valuable. It still contains 99% of the nuclear energy, and we know how to reprocess that and make fuel out of it. But people are blocking the construction of Yucca Mountain or any other repository. But in contrast, the waste from fossil fuels is killing, as the outdoor pollution is killing between 3 and 4 million people, in addition to the indoor air pollution, which is partly fossil fuels. So it's just irrational the way we ignore the pollution from one energy source and overemphasize that from another. In fact, the smallest environmental footprint of all the energy sources that we have is nuclear power. But somehow we're refusing to develop the much improved versions of that we could have for the future. So anyway, I think the two essential elements of the climate solution are these. However, East-West cooperation is vital. So it's really distressing when President Biden, as his first act, thumbed his nose at China and called Taiwan before he called China, the president of 1.4 billion people who are going to determine the future of the planet with their energy choices. We're all on one planet, and we need to understand this. You know, so I called the chairman of the nuclear engineering department at MIT, and so a few other experts in the United States, and they agreed we have to work with China. You know, if we would work with China in developing the best technology, China doesn't want to use this old technology like at Fukushima, even though we know we could have done that better. But we can make a much ultra-safe reactors. But they don't want. So we should work with China. Unfortunately, and so we wrote a paper in Science magazine, but then the U.S. government prohibited any cooperation with China. You know, we have to understand we're all in the same boat. We're either going to sink together or sail together. There's only one planet, and we're all, and our emissions go over the whole planet. So we've got to understand this. The good thing is this, that young people seem to be understanding. You know, there's now more than 350 college student body presidents agreed on this statement that they support carbon fee and dividend. And even leading high school leaders have announced their support for this. So we have young people understanding this. If we could just get our governments to understand it. And the other thing is, we have young people like this Good Energy Collective. And they all look like kids to me. I'm 80 years old. They're not, I mean, Jessica Lovering, who started this, is probably in her late 30s. She's a nuclear engineer. But they recognize that in order to make nuclear acceptable to the public, you have to communicate with the public, and you have to work with the social justice community. So the public needs to be honestly informed and involved in making decisions about energy sources. But that's encouraging that we have organizations like that. Let me mention, though, the most important problem. Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned us about the military-industrial complex. But, in fact, the first draft of his talk warned us about the military-industrial congressional complex. And when his brother, Milton Eisenhower, Dr. Milton Eisenhower, asked him, "Why did you eliminate congressional?" And he said, "It was more than enough to take on the military and private industry. I couldn't take on Congress as well." Unfortunately, that's the fundamental problem. As long as money is the fluid that's driving our government, we can't solve the problem. When Senator Kerry told me I can't get one vote for that, it was because all of these other senators had special interests that they're getting money from, and they have to satisfy. So, in my opinion, I just don't see how we're going to get those two parties. I mean, it's nice that some people are trying to get them to talk to each other, but fundamentally, we have to get money out of politics, or we can't solve the problem. When, you know, the first time I got involved in the non-science part was when I came to Virginia Tech to give a talk in 2008. And the students that picked me up at the airport asked me to, they told me about Larry Gibson, this little man, mountain man who wouldn't sell his property to the coal company, so they couldn't dig up Cayford Mountain where he lived, next to Coal River Mountain. And but those students then at Virginia Tech were all excited because of this candidate, Barack Obama, who all of them preferred over Hillary Clinton. Well, it was all this support from young people, especially in Iowa, at the caucuses in Iowa, that caused Obama to overtake Hillary Clinton. so the young people have enormous potential political power, and they know how to communicate with each other with social media and things. They need to use that power. Hillary Clinton, by the way, is a good example of this. She was asked, why did you take, I think it was $500,000 from the big banks in order to give a luncheon talk of about half an hour? And she said, well, that's what they offered. And as if she doesn't recognize that that's a bribe, that the big banks want to be treated well. And unfortunately, our political parties have treated them very well, as well as the pharmaceutical industry and all the other special interests that are bribing our government. And there's no way to solve that without getting money out of the government. So what I say is, we need a third political party. And this is something that young people, I think, should be thinking about and saying, what is on the platform of this? Well, of course, the first item on the platform has to be, we will take no money from special interests. And they don't need it. They've already shown, Obama didn't initially take money except the $25 donations from the public. He didn't take any of the big money. But then he decided, well, if he was going to win the election, he had better take big money. And so he was soon in the same boat as all the other politicians. But it's not necessary to do that. In fact, if the public saw a party and a candidate that was not taking money from special interests, they would flock to that party, in my opinion. But in order for a third party to work, you need to not put up a spoiler. So the candidate of a third party, if it's in a presidential election, has got to be under the control of the party. If the party says we're not going to run anyone this year, then you shouldn't have somebody with a big ego who insists he's going to run anyway and cause the worst candidate to get elected. But you can solve that problem completely if you have ranked voting. Assume you understand ranked voting. You list all of the candidates in your order of preference. So if nobody gets 50%, then the person who got the least votes is dropped, and whoever voted for that person, they get their second choice to be their first choice. And that way, you'll never get a spoiler causing someone who has less than 50% to get the winning position. So I think that young people and other people should be thinking about this, because I don't see a way to reform. The last person who tried to take money out of politics to have campaign finance reform was John McCain. And he couldn't do it. He tried very hard, and then realized if he wanted to be a candidate for president, he had to stop talking about that. And he stopped talking about that. Okay, so as this shows, there's a bunch of stuff on my website, and I especially think that this communication that I sent out last December is relevant reading for young people. Thank you. So I think the plan is, if you have questions, you can step up to one of these microphones and ask your question.
Hello, and thank you so much for coming here today. It was a pleasure to listen to you, and it was a lot of good, interesting ideas. told us. So I have a question about electric cars. You mentioned them once when you were talking in Sweden, and I've been thinking about them quite a lot lately. A lot of people see them as a way forward in terms of renewable energy and cutting emissions. But how do we look at them knowing that they consume a lot of energy and the batteries are made out of lithium, which is also hard to create and takes a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of energy, which is created with natural gas and coal. Knowing this, do you think electric cars are really the way forward, or do we need something better than that? Thank you.
Yeah, if I understood the question, it referred especially to the potential role of electric vehicles. Fundamental need is carbon-free electricity. If we had that, then electric vehicles would be a potential way to reduce the transportation emissions, which is a significant fraction of the emissions, of the order of a third, I think. It's not the only option for transportation. As I mentioned, without discussion, if you have carbon-free electricity, you can make liquid fuels, and that may be necessary. You know, there's a very quick, strong interest in electric vehicles, but that's only a fraction of the public, actually. There's a lot of the public who wants to have a vehicle which is not tied to electric source. So we may need also vehicles that run on liquid fuel. I actually had the privilege of driving an Audi, I think it was, which was powered by hydrogen, and that if you're going to use hydrogen as your fuel, you're going to have a whole new set of stations to provide that. So the way to find that out really is to have a rising price on carbon and let these alternatives compete. But that's not what we do. What we do is make a decision, and your wallets pay for it, is to, okay, I'm going to subsidize this, or I'm going to subsidize that. So right now we're subsidizing electric vehicles. They're still, and they're getting better, and their performance is good. You know, they have a lot of pep. They will get going in a hurry. So they may be a solution, part of the solution, but the way we should really find that out is to have this rising price on carbon, and every economist agrees with that. And all of the former heads of the Council of Environmental Quality and the President's economic advisors, they all say that. And our government won't do it because of the power of special interests. So the answer is I'm not certain whether electric is going to really take over and be the major vehicle. It might, but there are other things. You know, we're going to have liquid fuels for airplanes, and again, as I say, we can make them. So I'm not sure whether electric is going to be. I suspect it's going to be a big player, especially for things like buses, and it should have been our postal vehicles, things which they have to come back to the home base overnight anyway, so you can charge them overnight. That would work great in certain things, but may not work right for cowboys in Wyoming.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is King. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for coming out and speaking. I like your talk. In the beginning of your lecture, you were talking about the humanitarian things that happen in Ukraine, but I couldn't help but notice that you're going to talk about the same thing that's happened in Palestine, Yemen, in East Turkmenistan, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. And I was wondering why you didn't mention about those countries and the people that are also suffering at the same level, if not more.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. One of the things that I mentioned in that document that I wrote last December is the change that has occurred in the United States over the past half century, where, and this again is related to President Eisenhower. You know, at the end of World War II, we were the shining city on a hill, and providing the example. And President Kennedy introduced the Peace Corps, sending young people as an alternative to military service to be in the Peace Corps and go to developing countries and provide help, and that changed. Now, and I give a link to a little film that details how many countries the United States has military presence, and you know how many countries we've interfered with the government to replace a government that we thought we didn't like with one that we liked better. Of course, you know about Iraq and how that turned out, and what it cost us and what it cost our young children, because we've got a debt to pay all those soldiers who were injured for the rest of their lives. We need to, and that's why when I say, when I think, imagine a third party, I imagine a party finding a JFK type president, and he had better have a writer like Ted Sorensen who could write the things like, you know, we go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And even later, anyway, the point is we need to get back to higher standards of what we stand for as a country, and provide the example which is based on our principles, not on attempting to use military force. Of course, we have to, now in the real world, there are so many threats that you must have good intelligence. And there's nothing wrong with having the best intelligence in the world, as we've seen with the Ukraine situation, where President Biden used our knowledge of exactly what Russia was planning to do to tell everybody what they're planning to do and kind of foil what they were trying to do to some extent. So intelligence is necessary, but you need to have principles that you stand for, and you need to follow those principles. And we're, in many of those countries that you mentioned, we're not doing that. We need to start afresh. And again, it's related to money and related to the military, industrial, congressional cooperation. I see those problems, but I think the way to solve those is to really get back to the basics and what do we stand for as a country. that's possible, but we need new leadership to do it. And I just don't, as long as money is the principal thing driving our representatives, then I don't see us fixing it.
In the interest of time, we have time for one more question. I think it's on your side, and the others, you are invited to talk to Dr. Hansen afterwards, and he'll be available. Thanks.
Hi, so I had a question about fixing symptoms of climate change versus tackling the problems. I've been researching material sciences that can, that when they absorb light, they reflect the light at IR transparent windows, so the atmosphere doesn't absorb them. It mitigates the greenhouse effect, which would lead to cooling, but obviously that doesn't take away the carbon in the atmosphere itself. So I guess it's something that we have the technology to do now, and we could get the money to do now, but it wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, but it would alleviate a lot of the symptoms. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's the subject of a paper that's included in a paper that I'm hoping to finish within a month. We have in the pipeline a lot of additional warming, even if we were able to reduce emissions rapidly. So the highest priority has to be on reducing emissions, because as the questioner was implying, so he's asking about, he's asking about the fact that, well, the planet is only out of energy balance by about 1 watt. We could reflect some sunlight away, and it would no longer be out of balance. It would stop warming. And he correctly says that that's not a solution completely, because it would, the acidification of the ocean and the other effects of excess CO2 would still be there. And you'd be, in effect, if you did this by means of putting particles in the atmosphere or increasing the cloud cover, you would be sort of replacing combining two pollutants and trying to balance them out. And there's a strong reservations about doing that. But the fact is that we have probably passed a point where just reducing emissions is not going to allow for an acceptable consequences. It's a thing, you know, I've written a proposal to try to understand what happened in the last interglacial period, which was about 1 degree warmer than today, less than 1 degree now, because we've warmed up so much in the last few decades. Because sea level went up several meters very quickly in less than a century during this prior warm period, which was 130,000 years ago. I think we have to avoid that. We can't allow the loss of our coastal cities. So there's a very good chance that we will have to temporarily take such actions to reflect sunlight and avoid disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. But that we have to prove. And this decade is crucial, I think, for both getting our emissions to start going down, but also to understand this problem, because we may have to take such actions. And frankly, they're not that, you know, I showed in a paper that we gave in Xi'an, China, 3 years ago, that you can spray salt particles into the atmosphere in the Southern Ocean. This is, you know, north of Antarctica, nobody lives there, and increase the reflectivity of the clouds in that part of the world, and balance the planet's radiation budget. But we have to prove that that's not causing some other problem. But I think it's very likely that during your lifetime you're going to see that we have to do some things, because it's so difficult to phase down the fossil fuel use, especially when we're too stupid to work with China and India and the places where the emissions are going up and help them reduce their emissions. Thanks.